The evening was warm. The house was alive with laughter and chatter, the sounds of clinking glasses and the murmur of old friends and family mingling together. It was a night of celebration, a night to honor 29 years of marriage between Alfred and Kimberly. In the living room, guests were scattered around, holding drinks, reminiscing, and making toasts. Alfred, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, moved through the crowd with a smile, his glass held high as he joined a small group of friends. Here's to 29 years of love, commitment, and a lot of patience. Alfred's old friend, Carlton, chuckled, raising his glass. To 29 more, Alfred replied, clinking his glass with the others. The group laughed, their camaraderie evident as they exchanged stories of the past. Across the room, Kimberly stood at the center of a group of their old college friends. Her bright red dress shimmered under the soft lights as she laughed, her voice carrying above the hum of the party. She was animated, gesturing as she told a story, drawing everyone's attention. Alfred caught her eye from across the room, and she gave him a playful wink. He felt a warmth spread through his chest. After all the ups and downs in that moment, he believed they had truly made it. As the evening wore on, the alcohol flowed more freely, and the conversations grew louder. Kimberly, with a drink in hand, moved from group to group, her laughter echoing through the room. She was the star of the evening, effortlessly charming everyone around her. But as the clock inched closer to midnight, something shifted. Kimberly, now tipsy, began to speak louder, her words sharper. "Do you remember our first year of marriage, Alf?" she called out across the room, her voice tinged with something darker than affection. "You were so clueless back then, so naive." Alfred, caught off guard, smiled uneasily. "Well, we were just kids, weren't we?" "Oh, we were. And you've always been such a good boy, haven't you?" Her laughter rang out, but there was an edge to it that made a few guests shift uncomfortably. "Kimberly," Alfred said, trying to keep his voice light, "how about we get some coffee?" She waved him off, her expression defiant. No, let's talk about it. After all, it's our 29th anniversary. Shouldn't we be honest with each other?" The room grew quieter as people began to sense the tension. Kimberly looked around, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous excitement. "You all know Alf, right? Mr. Reliable, Mr. Faithful, Mr. Clueless." She took a long sip from her glass, her smile turning mocking. "But here's the funny part. I've been the one having all the fun." Alfred's smile faltered, the warmth draining from his face. He stared at her, his mind racing. "Kimberly, what are you talking about?" "Oh, come on, Alf. Don't be so dense." She laughed again, the sound harsh. "Do you really think I've been satisfied with your tiny manhood all these years?" The room fell silent, all eyes on the couple. Alfred felt his heart pounding, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. What are you saying?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Kimberly grinned, her expression cruel. "I'm saying, darling husband, that I've had a lot of fun behind your back. In fact," she glanced around the room, her gaze settling on several men, "I'd say at least half of the men here know exactly what my coochie looks like." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some guests looked away, embarrassed, while others exchanged shocked glances. Alfred felt the world tilt around him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Kimberly, this isn't funny." "Oh, it's not meant to be funny, Alf." She pointed at two of his cousins, who stood frozen, horror etched on their faces. "Remember that wild night we had, boys? The threesome? Now that was fun. So much more exciting than anything I've ever had with this loser." The room erupted into chaos. People began shouting, trying to defuse the situation, but Alfred could only see red. The rage, betrayal, and humiliation hit him all at once, overwhelming any sense of control he had left. Without thinking, he lunged at one of his cousins, fists clenched. "You bastards!" he roared, swinging at the first cousin, his fist connecting with a sickening thud. Screams filled the room as the party descended into madness. Kimberly stood there, laughing wildly, while guests tried to pull Alfred off his cousin. But he was beyond reason, consumed by a fury that had taken over every fiber of his being. Someone must have called the police. because before Alfred knew it, officers burst through the door, shouting for everyone to stand down. But he couldn't stop. Grabbing a bottle from the table, he swung it at the second cousin, the glass shattering on impact. "Enough!" an officer shouted, tackling Alfred to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back. The party was in ruins, guests were in shock, and Alfred's life was unraveling before his eyes. As the officers hauled him up, he caught a glimpse of Kimberly. She was being restrained by two guests, her laughter gone, replaced by a look of cold satisfaction. "You never really knew me, Alf," she whispered as he was led away. Those words echoed in Alfred's mind as the officers guided him out of the house, the world outside dark and unwelcoming. The sounds of the party faded behind him, leaving only the cold realization that his perfect illusion had been shattered beyond repair. The harsh, sterile light of the police station replaced the warmth of the night left behind. Alfred sat on the cold bench inside the holding cell, his knuckles bruised, his mind spinning. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier had drained away, leaving a hollow despair in its place. He replayed the night's events over and over, unable to grasp how everything had unraveled so quickly. Across from him, his two cousins sat in silence, their faces a mix of fear and anger. They avoided his gaze, but the tension between them was palpable, hanging heavy in the small, confined space. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly before a police officer finally approached the cell. "Alfred, you're free to go. Your lawyer's here." Alfred stood, his body aching from the fight and the rough handling by the police. Each movement was a painful reminder of what had happened. As he stepped out of the cell, he saw his lawyer, Henry, waiting with a grave expression. Henry was an old family friend, someone who had seen Alfred through thick and thin. But tonight there was no camaraderie in his eyes, only concern. "Let's get you out of here," Henry said quietly, placing a hand on Alfred's shoulder as he guided him through the maze of corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the sterile walls. The drive home was silent. Alfred stared out the window, his thoughts numb. The once familiar streets felt foreign now, as if everything had shifted in the wake of what had happened. When they finally pulled up to his house, Henry turned to him, his face etched with worry. "Alfred, you need to think about what comes next," Henry said carefully, breaking the silence. "This is going to be a mess, and you need to be prepared. There's going to be fallout, from Kimberly, from your family, from the community." Alfred nodded, but his mind was far from the logistics of what lay ahead. "What do I do, Henry? What the hell do I do now?" Henry sighed, his expression softening. "You need to talk to Kimberly. Figure out what happened tonight. Then, we'll go from there." But the thought of facing Kimberly again made Alfred's stomach churn. The image of her laughing, mocking him in front of everyone, was burned into his mind. How had everything gone so wrong? How had he missed the signs? They stepped out of the car, and the sight that greeted them was like a punch to the gut. The house, which had been filled with joy and celebration just hours ago, now stood dark and silent. The remnants of the party were everywhere. Broken glasses, spilled drinks, discarded plates. It looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Henry placed a reassuring hand on Alfred's back. "Call me when you're ready to talk," he said, his voice gentle. With that, he left Alfred standing alone in the wreckage of his life. Alfred wandered through the house, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each room was a painful reminder of what had happened. He found himself in the living room, the very spot where Kimberly's cruel words had shattered his world. The memories flooded back, the laughter, the mocking tone in her voice, the way she had looked at him with something close to disdain. He sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. How had it come to this? How had the woman he loved for nearly 3 decades turned into a stranger before his eyes? A noise from behind made him look up. Kimberly stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. The fire and defiance from earlier were gone, replaced by something much more fragile. She took a tentative step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alf, don't," Alfred snapped, his voice cold, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Don't you dare." She flinched but didn't retreat. "Alf, I don't know what to say." "There's nothing to say, bitch," Alfred replied, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. You made it pretty clear how you feel. Kimberly bit her lip, tears welling in her eyes. Alf, I was drunk. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Drunk? That's your excuse? Alfred interrupted, his voice rising with anger. You didn't just slip up, Kimberly. You planned this, didn't you? You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone. Our friends, our family. You wanted to destroy everything we've built. No, that's not true, Kimberly pleaded, stepping closer, but Alfred held up his hand, stopping her in her tracks. Then what is true? He demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Was any of it true? The affairs? The threesomes? Or were those just more lies to get a reaction out of me? Kimberly looked down, her silence telling him more than words ever could. The truth hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling. He collapsed back onto the couch, his hands shaking as he tried to process it all. How long, Kimberly? How long have you been lying to me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kimberly hesitated, then finally spoke, her voice trembling. Almost 15 years. 15 years. Nearly half their marriage had been a lie. The betrayal twisted in his chest, sharp and unforgiving. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with hurt and disbelief. Why? Why would you do this? Kimberly wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice breaking as she answered. I don't know, Alf. I was lonely. You were always so focused on work, on providing for us, and I started feeling invisible. At first, it was just harmless flirting, but then it became something more. I was selfish, Alf. I'm so sorry. Alfred shook his head, anger flaring up again. You felt invisible? So your solution was to sleep with half the town? You could have talked to me, Kimberly. You could have told me how you felt. I tried. Kimberly cried, her voice rising in desperation. But every time I brought it up, you brushed me off. You acted like everything was fine, like nothing was wrong. I was desperate, Alfred. I made terrible choices, and I hate myself for it. The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable, but it did little to ease the pain in Alfred's chest. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window and staring out into the night. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Finally, Alfred spoke, his voice cold and detached. I don't know how we move forward from this, Kimberly. You've betrayed me in the worst possible way. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. Kimberly's sobs filled the room, but Alfred didn't turn around. He couldn't bear to look at her, not now. I'm going to stay with Henry for a few days, he said quietly. I need time to think. Alf, please don't leave me, Kimberly begged, her voice full of desperation. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can. Alfred turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Kimberly, you've had years to come clean, to make things right. But you didn't. You chose to keep lying, to keep hurting me. I don't know if there's anything left to fix. He grabbed his coat and keys, heading for the door. Kimberly rushed after him, grabbing his arm. Alf, please. I love you. I've always loved you. Alfred gently pulled his arm free, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. I don't know what that means anymore, Kimberly. Maybe I never did. He walked out the door, leaving Kimberly standing in the hallway, her tears falling silently onto the floor. The night air was cool against his skin as he walked to his car, the weight of everything pressing down on him. As he drove away, the memories of their life together flashed through his mind. Moments of joy, of love, of trust, now tainted by the bitter taste of betrayal. The road ahead was dark, and Alfred had no idea where it would lead. Alfred had been staying at Henry's house for several days, trying to find some semblance of clarity. The time away from home gave him space, but it also left him alone with the crushing weight of his thoughts. He would sit for hours in the guest bedroom, staring blankly at the walls, his mind looping through the same agonizing memories of that night. On the third morning, as he sat on the bed, he noticed a photograph in his wallet. It was of him and Kimberly on their wedding day. He picked it up, tracing the edges of their smiling faces with his finger. They looked so innocent, so blissfully unaware of the storms that lay ahead. The contrast between the hope in that picture and the despair he felt now was almost unbearable. His phone buzzed beside him, pulling him back to the present. It was a message from Kimberly. Asterisk, please come home. We need to talk. Asterisk. Alfred stared at the screen, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He hadn't spoken to her since he left, hadn't even responded to her previous messages. But he knew he couldn't stay away forever. He couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened, or the fact that they needed to face it together, one way or another. With a deep sigh, he typed back a simple reply. I'll be there soon. The drive back to the house was quiet. The roads were familiar, yet everything felt different. As he pulled into the driveway, a wave of unease washed over him. The house, once a symbol of everything he had worked for, now felt like a stranger. He sat in the car for a moment, staring at the front door, trying to summon the strength to go inside. Kimberly was in the living room when he walked in, standing by the window with her arms crossed. She turned when she heard him enter, and their eyes met. The sight of her, visibly worn and broken, filled him with a mix of anger and pity. Alf, she began softly, her voice trembling as if it might shatter. I'm glad you came. He didn't respond immediately, just stood there, taking in the tension that hung heavy in the room. He finally spoke, his voice flat. You said we needed to talk. So talk. And also, this is my house. Kimberly nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about whether we can move forward. I know I hurt you, Alf. I know I've done something unforgivable. Alfred remained silent, his expression unreadable, forcing her to continue. I want to make things right, she said, her voice cracking. I want to try therapy, to figure out how we ended up here. I want to understand why I did what I did, and if there's any way to rebuild what we had. Alfred clenched his fists at his sides, trying to control the wave of anger that rose in him. You think therapy is going to fix this? That it'll erase everything you've done? No, Kimberly replied quickly, shaking her head. I know it won't. I know I can't undo the past. But I'm asking for a chance, Alf. A chance to show you that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be the wife you deserve. The sincerity in her voice was clear, but it did little to soothe the pain gnawing at Alfred's heart. He took a step closer, his eyes searching hers for any sign of the woman he thought he knew. How can I trust you again, Kimberly? How can I believe anything you say after what you did? Kimberly looked down, her shoulders sagging under the weight of his words. I don't expect you to trust me right away. I don't even know if you ever will. But I'm asking you to give me a chance to earn it back, one step at a time. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken fears and doubts that neither of them knew how to express. Alfred felt a surge of conflicting emotions, rage, sorrow, and a faint glimmer of something like hope, though he couldn't be sure. He looked away, rubbing his temples as if he could massage away the confusion in his mind. Do you really believe we can get through this? He asked quietly, almost to himself. Kimberly took a tentative step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Alf, but I want to try. I'm willing to fight for us if you are. Alfred turned back to face her, his eyes hard. You had years to fight for us, Kimberly. Years to be honest, to tell me how you were feeling instead of turning to someone else, turning to them. How do I know this isn't just more lies? I can't ask you to believe me. Not yet, Kimberly admitted, her voice trembling. But I want to prove to you that I'm serious. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Alf, please, just give me a chance. He studied her, searching her face for any sign of deception. But all he saw was a woman who looked as lost and broken as he felt. It didn't change what she had done, didn't erase the betrayal, but it was enough to make him hesitate, to make him wonder if there was still something worth saving. After what felt like an eternity, Alfred let out a long breath. We'll take it one day at a time, he said finally, his voice resigned. But don't think for a second that this is going to be easy, or that I'm going to forgive you overnight. This is going to take a lot of work, and even then, I don't know if it'll be enough. Kimberly nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. I understand, Alf, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. They stood there, a fragile truce between them, both knowing that the road ahead would be long and painful. There were no guarantees, No promises that things would ever be the same. But for the first time since that night, there was at least a small, tentative step toward something new, toward the possibility of healing, however distant it might be. Alfred walked to the couch and sat down, the weight of everything pressing down on him. Kimberly hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, leaving a careful distance between them. They sat in silence, the enormity of what lay ahead hanging over them like a cloud. But in that silence, there was also the faintest flicker of hope, fragile and uncertain, but present all the same. Alfred and Kimberly sat in the waiting room, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound breaking the silence between them. The room was sterile, almost clinical, with its beige walls and worn-out furniture. It was a far cry from the comfort of home, but perhaps that was fitting. Home had become a place of discomfort, a place where trust had been shattered. When Dr. Harper opened the door and called their names, Alfred stood up first, his movements stiff and deliberate. Kimberly followed, her steps hesitant as if she were walking towards something unknown and terrifying. They entered the office, and Dr. Harper gestured for them to sit on the small couch facing her desk. Alfred sat at the edge, his hands resting on his knees, while Kimberly settled beside him, leaving a noticeable gap between them. "Welcome," Dr. Harper said, her voice calm, yet authoritative. "This space is for both of you. It's a place where you can express your feelings openly, without fear of judgment. We're here to understand what happened and what you both want moving forward." Alfred stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with both Kimberly and Dr. Harper. The silence stretched out, filling the room with a sense of awkwardness that was almost suffocating. Dr. Harper allowed the silence to linger for a moment before turning to Kimberly. "Kimberly, why don't you start?" Dr. Harper suggested, her tone gentle but firm. "Tell Alfred what led you to make the choices you did." Kimberly swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Alf, I know I've said this before, but I was lonely. You were always busy with work, always distracted. It felt like I wasn't important to you anymore, like I was just there. When other men started paying attention to me, I took it. It made me feel alive again. But I know it was wrong. It was selfish." Alfred's grip on his knees tightened. "You could have told me, Kimberly," he said, his voice low, barely controlled. "You could have talked to me instead of this." Kimberly looked at him, her eyes pleading. "I tried, Alf. I did. But every time I brought it up, you brushed me off, told me you were too tired or too busy. I felt like I was screaming into the void." Dr. Harper stepped in, her voice even. "Kimberly, it's important to acknowledge your feelings, but also to take responsibility for your actions. While it's understandable that you felt neglected, the choices you made were yours alone." Kimberly nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'm not trying to excuse what I did. I'm not. I want you to understand how I got to that point, Alf." Alfred finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a mixture of hurt, betrayal, and something else, something softer, though he wasn't ready to admit what it was. "I don't know if I'll ever understand," he said, his voice strained. "But I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying to figure this out." Dr. Harper turned to Alfred. "Alfred, what do you need from Kimberly to begin healing? What can she do to help you through this?" Alfred took a long, slow breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "I need honesty," he said, his voice steady. "I need to know that there are no more secrets, no more lies. If there's anything else you haven't told me, Kimberly, I need to know now. And I need time. I can't just pretend like everything's okay." Kimberly nodded vigorously. "You have my word, Alf. I'll tell you everything. No more lies. And I'll give you all the time you need. I promise." The session continued, with Dr. Harper guiding them through the difficult conversation. They spoke about their past, their present, and the uncertain future. The tension in the room was palpable, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. As the session came to a close, Dr. Harper leaned back in her chair, her gaze moving between them. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone serious but encouraging. "There's a lot of work ahead, and it won't be easy. But if you're both committed to this process, there's potential for healing. Remember, progress isn't always linear. There will be setbacks, but it's how you navigate them that matters. Alfred and Kimberly left the office, the air between them thick with unspoken words. As they walked to the car, Alfred kept a slight distance, his mind racing with everything that had been said. Kimberly hesitated before opening the car door, glancing at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Do you want to grab a coffee or something?" she asked tentatively, breaking the silence. Alfred paused, considering the offer. "Sure," he replied after a moment, his voice neutral. "Why not?" They drove to a nearby cafe, the silence in the car filled with the quiet hum of the engine. When they arrived, they ordered their drinks and sat at a small table by the window. Alfred stared out at the street, watching people pass by, while Kimberly fiddled with the cup in her hands. "This feels strange, doesn't it?" Kimberly said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. Alfred looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it does." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, the awkwardness hanging between them like a heavy fog. Finally, Kimberly spoke again, her voice trembling. I'm really scared. I'm scared that I've lost you forever." Alfred sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm scared too, Kimberly. But I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying to figure this out, just like you." Kimberly nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Alf. I really am." "I know," Alfred replied softly, "but sorry isn't enough. We've got a long way to go, Kimberly." As the weeks passed, they continued with therapy, slowly peeling back the layers of their relationship. Each session was a step forward, even if some were more painful than others. They talked about the years of neglect, the small resentments that had festered, and the choices that had led them to this point. There were moments of anger, moments of regret, but also moments of understanding. Outside of therapy, they made an effort to spend more time together, trying to rebuild what had been broken. They went for walks, talked about their day, and even managed to laugh together once or twice. It wasn't easy. There were days when the pain was too much, when Alfred would retreat into himself, unable to look at Kimberly without feeling the sting of betrayal. But there were also days when they found comfort in each other's company, when they remembered the love that had brought them together in the first place. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Kimberly reached over and took Alfred's hand. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Alfred looked at her, his expression softening just a bit. "I didn't do it for you, Kimberly," he replied, his tone serious. "I did it for me. I needed to know if there was anything left worth fighting for." Kimberly squeezed his hand gently, a small smile playing at her lips. "And is there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alfred didn't answer right away. He looked out at the horizon, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, the day slowly giving way to night. "Maybe," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm, "maybe there is." And in that moment, as they sat together in the fading light, it felt like a fragile step forward, one of many they would have to take, but a step nonetheless. Months passed, and though the wounds between Alfred and Kimberly slowly began to heal, it was anything but a smooth process. They had their share of setbacks. Heated arguments flared up unexpectedly, and moments of doubt crept in when they least expected it. But despite these challenges, they were both committed to the journey. Each knew that rebuilding what had been shattered would take time, and they both were willing to put in the effort. Their social circle reacted with a mixture of support and skepticism. Friends and family were there for them, offering kind words and gestures. Yet, whispers and rumors circulated, making it difficult for Alfred to face people at first. The public nature of their ordeal had left him feeling exposed and embarrassed. However, as the months went by, he found strength in his decision to try to make things work. His resolve grew, and with it, the ability to hold his head high, even in the face of judgment. One chilly afternoon, after a particularly grueling therapy session, they lingered in Dr. Harper's office. She looked at them thoughtfully, her hands folded on the desk. "Healing is a journey, not a destination," she said, her voice measured. "You won't wake up one day and suddenly find that everything is fixed. But if you continue to work together, to communicate openly and honestly, you can build something new, something that might even be stronger than what you had before. Alfred and Kimberly left the session in silence, each lost in their thoughts. Dr. Harper's words echoed in their minds as they walked to the car. The idea of building something new, something potentially stronger, gave them both a flicker of hope. They held on to that hope, determined to make it a reality. At home, they began to find joy in the small things again. Cooking dinner together became a nightly ritual. They'd laugh over the stove as they experimented with new recipes, occasionally burning a dish but always finding humor in it. Their evening walks grew longer, the conversation flowing more freely as they talked about everything from the mundane to the meaningful. It was as if they were rediscovering each other, and in doing so, rediscovering the reasons they had fallen in love in the first place. One evening, nearly a year after their world had come crashing down, Alfred decided to do something special. He spent the day planning, making sure every detail was just right. When Kimberly arrived home from work, she found the dining table set with candles, the soft glow casting a warm light across the room. Soft music played in the background, and the aroma of a home-cooked meal filled the air. Kimberly paused at the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and a touch of emotion. Alfred stepped forward, pulling out a chair for her. "I thought we could celebrate us," he said simply. "Not the past, not the mistakes, but the fact that we're still here, still trying." Kimberly sat down, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Alf, this is beautiful. Thank you." They shared a quiet, heartfelt dinner, the atmosphere between them warm and filled with a renewed sense of connection. The conversation flowed easily, a mixture of laughter and reminiscing. It felt like they had finally turned a corner, leaving the darkest days behind them. For the first time in a long while, there was a sense of peace between them, a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Alfred retrieved a small gift box from the mantelpiece. He handed it to Kimberly with a soft smile. "Open it," he urged, his eyes twinkling with anticipation. Kimberly carefully unwrapped the box, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a simple, elegant bracelet. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears again. "It's beautiful, Alf. Thank you." Alfred reached out, taking her hand in his. His expression grew serious, though his eyes were full of affection. "This isn't just a gift, Kimberly," he said quietly. "It's a promise that I'm willing to keep fighting for us, for as long as it takes. I can't promise that everything will be perfect, but I can promise that I won't give up." Kimberly's heart swelled with emotion. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist, her voice barely a whisper as she replied, "I promise the same, Alf. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your love and forgiveness." They held each other close, the warmth of their embrace speaking volumes. In that moment, they both understood that while their journey was far from over, they had found a new beginning. This beginning wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain hadn't existed. It was about building something new on the foundation of their shared experiences, both the good and the bad. As they stood together, the past no longer seemed like a burden, but rather a part of their story. A story that was still being written, chapter by chapter, day by day. Each step they took was tentative, but it was a step forward nonetheless. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Alfred turned to Kimberly, his voice soft in the darkness. "You know, I wasn't sure we'd ever get to this point." Kimberly turned to face him, her hand resting on his chest. "Neither was I," she admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Alfred smiled in the dark, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too," he said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt truly hopeful about what the future might hold for them. Together, they closed their eyes, drifting off to sleep with the knowledge that they had survived the storm. Now, it was time to see where the calm would take them.